you find homosexuality to be a sin?
Doesn't matter what I find. It's not my opinion what's right and
The
wrong.
Bible says.
I don't think we ought to impose my morality. I don't think we ought to impose your morality. I think we ought to impose the morality.
Either the society decides what's right, or there's a standard beyond society that is right, and therefore you can judge societies by that standard. Which is your view?
Why, according to you, when God plays God by taking a life prematurely in the Old Testament, is it a moral outrage, but when you play God by taking a life prematurely through an abortion, it is a moral right?
I can't be any more concise than that. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. That was it. Something that happened 20 years ago on Capitol Hill really shocked me. It got my attention. This man at the time was Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas, and he had a picture he wanted to show a senator in California. This photograph was of a 21-week-old fetus in the womb who had been spared abortion by doctors who operated in the womb to correct a birth defect. This is the picture that maybe some of you have seen. You can see the little hand coming out of the womb there, grasping the doctor. Here's a better picture of the entire arm coming out of the womb as the doctor operated to fix a defect in this young man whose name was Samuel, ironically, the same name as the senator. Anyway, Senator Brownback said, "Is this the hand of a person or just the hand of a piece of property?" And the senator from California at the time was Senator Barbara Boxer, and here's how she responded: "I am not a doctor and I am not God. I trust other human beings to make these decisions." Ladies and gentlemen, do you have to be a doctor or do you have to be God to know that that's a human being? And by the way, what are lawmakers supposed to do? They're supposed to make these decisions. That's why they're there. We elect them to go there and make decisions like this. And yet she decided she couldn't make the decision. Well, actually she did. You know what decision she made? That is not a human being, because she was for what is known as partial birth abortion. Have you heard of partial birth abortion? That's where you take a fully developed baby at the 8 or 9 month mark, partially deliver the baby, and then drill a hole in the back of the baby's skull, and you take a vacuum and you suck the brains out. And then you deliver a dead baby. And Barbara Boxer couldn't be against this. Maybe it's because she couldn't legislate morality. Can we legislate morality? We're going to try and do this in 5 steps tonight, ladies and gentlemen. First thing we're going to try and discover is, does objective morality exist? Secondly, but you can't legislate morality, can you? I mean, even if it does exist, who are we to say how somebody else ought to live? Thirdly, we're going to ask the question, should Christians even be involved in politics? We're always told we ought not be involved in politics. Then we'll ask the question, what are the most important issues in politics? And then finally, what are the top 10 questions you should ask somebody about politics and legislating morality, if in fact you can do that? And then if I time this just right, we'll have absolutely no time for questions. Now we'll have time for questions. You see we have the microphone set up here. Now there is a warning that I need to give you as we go through this material. The warning is I intend to be correct, not politically correct. Now, unfortunately, politics is very sensitive for many people, and I'm not here to upset anyone, but I do want to tell you the truth as I see it anyway. And I like what the great economist Thomas Sowell, who's now 92 years old, has said about helping people. He said, if you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. We're not here to tell you what you want to hear. You can just turn on the news or go to social media and hear what you want to hear. I hope to tell you, hopefully, the truth, and you can be the evaluator and see if I'm telling you the truth. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through the material. If I go too quickly, I'm going to send you the entire PowerPoint presentation. All you need to do is text this word evidence to this phone number, 855-909-0582. 855-909-0582. Those out there in internet land can do the same thing. In fact, I'm not just going to send you this PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format. I'm going to send you 5 or 6 others, okay? And I'll put this up at the end. We do have some books available out there as well. And I want to point out that all the proceeds from the sale of the books will go to feed needy children. Mine. Thanks for blowing my joke. Actually, it's not a joke. I got 3 sons. In fact, one of them is here right now. Well, let me just tell you about the oldest one. The oldest one is an intel officer in the Air Force up in Anchorage, where Glenn was. So he's reading your email right now. The second son is a KC-10 pilot. You guys know what a KC-10 is? A KC-10 is a big refueling plane that goes out and refuels other planes in flight. So what we say about Spencer is that every day he flies up to 30,000 feet, he sits around, and he passes gas. And here he is. There he is, right back there. Spence, wave to them. He's just in town right now. There's my son Spencer. He's also a major in the Air Force, but he's about to start with American Airlines here, so he is bringing his wife and our 2 grandsons to Charlotte, where we live. So that's going to be great. Third son, not in the military, but he is out of the house, so my wife and I are now empty nesters. Yeah, it took us a while to get used to that. About 10 minutes. That's how long it took to change the locks. All right, let's get started. You guys ready to go? All right, the first thing we're going to talk about is objective morality. And let me ask you this. Are these things rights? Is abortion a right? Is life a right? Well, if you say one or the other, if someone in here says abortion's a right and another person here says life is a right, we have a conflict, don't we? Someone is claiming a moral position. Do I have a right to marry whom I love? Do I? Well, it depends. Do I have a right to marry my sister? Ooh. Do I have a right to force you to participate in my wedding? There's a lot of people out there doing that right now. Do I have a right to transition even if I'm a child? That's going on right now. If you say yes, does a parent have a right to bring up their child according to the parent's values? Well, what if the child has a right to transition and the parent doesn't want that? We got a conflict here, don't we? Do I have a right to live my truth? You live your truth, I'll live my truth. Doesn't that sound right? Well, no matter how you answer these questions, let me ask you this. By what standard are these rights? What is your standard when you say someone has a right to X, whatever X is? Where are you getting that from? The Bible. Well, what if you don't believe in the Bible? Constitution. What if you don't live in America? Do you have rights? Where do you get rights from? God is always a good answer at Liberty University. He took a risk there. Well, think about it. If there's no God, are there any rights? No, it would just be your opinion against somebody else's opinion. If there's no standard beyond us that endows us with certain rights, then all you're saying is, I prefer this and maybe you prefer that. But it seems in our culture, we're inventing, I should say, rights every 10 minutes. Maybe a way of looking at this is this. Let me ask you guys a question. How do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six? That's when he throws it to the other team and the other team takes it back for a touchdown. How do you know that? What do you have to know that the touchdown's better than the pick six? What do you have to know? Not just a scoreboard. What do you have to know? Not just rules. You guys are sounding like Charlie Brown's teacher right now. Come on. The only way you can know that a touchdown is better than a pick six is if you know the purpose of the game. If there's no purpose to the game, you can't say a touchdown gets you closer to the purpose and a pick six takes you further away. You've got to have some standard by which to judge these plays. Now, think about this. In football, the purpose and the rules of the game come from outside the game. You know, when the Chiefs and the Eagles a couple of weeks ago were playing the Super Bowl. When they showed up there in Arizona, the field was already set, the rules were already made. They didn't make up the rules, right? Where did the rules come from? It came from the commissioner and the owners, and every once in a while they tweak the rules a little bit. Now, the rules of football are arbitrary. They could be different, right? But they do come from outside the game. Same thing is true in life. The rules and the purpose of life comes from outside of life. It comes from the Creator, the standard beyond us. And He says, this is the right way to live. This is the wrong way to live. If He doesn't exist, there is no right or wrong way to live. Everything's just a matter of opinion. And yet there are many people in our culture today claiming they have a right, and yet they don't have any way to ground these rights. But you know, Thomas Jefferson did not ground our rights in the Bible, even though he may have believed some aspects of the Bible. Where did Thomas Jefferson ground our rights? In natural law, which comes from the same source as the Bible, God. He famously said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. And basically what he said, when a government doesn't secure the rights, then the people have the right to a new government. And the whole Declaration of Independence is all about the fact that King George was legislating immorally. He was taking the rights away from the people. He wasn't protecting their rights. And so Jefferson said, we need a new government. Now notice Jefferson brilliantly grounded rights in God, but he also wanted religious freedom because they came from the Church of England. They didn't want that. So he had the perfect middle alternative between trying to legislate the Bible and trying to just have anarchy or just human-made law. He said, we want rights coming from God, but you don't have to be a Christian to have them. They come from God. You don't have to be a Christian in order to experience or hold these rights. Now you say, okay, so there must be rights out there, but what if somebody comes along and says, well, there is no the truth, only my truth? You're saying you have these objective rights? Is that really true? What if I have my own opinion on this? Well, in order to deal with the question of truth, whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson. Right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand and he said to him, Colonel, I want the truth. And Nicholson said, you can't handle the truth. Liberty, he did not say it that way. That was completely lame. If he said it that way, the movie would have gone nowhere. You can't handle that. That's not how he said it. Here's how he said it.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, let's try that again. I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Now that felt better, didn't it? Didn't you always want to do that in church? You can't handle the truth. Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. In fact, they say things like, there is no the truth, only my truth, or you have your truth, I have my truth, or there is no truth. Now, here's an easy way of pointing out why these people are actually wrong when they say these things. In fact, if someone were to come up to you and say there is no truth, you should ask that person a question. What should the question be? Yeah, if somebody says there's no truth, you simply say, hey, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Did I say that right? I know this can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough, because this is known as a self-defeating statement. What's a self-defeating statement? A self-defeating statement doesn't meet its own standard. A self-defeating statement violates the law of non-contradiction, which says opposite ideas cannot be both true at the same time and in the same sense. Now, how many people in here have ever taken a course on logic? Let me see your hands, please. Thank you, homeschoolers. All right, good. Yeah, if we taught logic in public school, it would be a lot better. But we don't teach logic anymore. And so many of the statements you hear in our culture, particularly in politics, are logically self-defeating. What's a self-defeating statement? Well, this is one. How about if I were to say, I can't speak a word in English? What would you say? Hey, you just used English to say it, right? This is a logically self-defeating statement. And here's how you can identify these self-defeating statements. You turn the claim on itself. Turn the claim on itself. So if somebody says there's no truth, you turn the claim on itself and you say, is that true? All right, let's just do a couple more and we'll arrive where we started. How about if somebody says, all truth is relative? You've probably heard people say that. If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? Yeah, you could say that, Sam, or you could say, hey, is that a relative truth, right? You just look at the claim and you say, does it meet its own standard? No, this is an absolute truth claiming all truths are relative. It defeats itself. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Now, it isn't said this way much anymore today. Today it's said, like I just mentioned, there is no the truth, only my truth. In other words, you have your truth, I have my truth, you live your truth, I'll live my truth, we'll all get along, right? It sounds so right, doesn't it? It sounds so Oprah. It's like everybody ought to believe this. There's just one problem. If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask back? You could say, is that your truth? Actually, if somebody says there isn't the truth, only my truth, you're simply going to ask them, is that just your truth or the truth? You see this statement up here? If you just ask them, is that just your truth? Well, if it's just your truth, why should I believe it, right? If it's not really true for everybody, if it's just your truth, why should I believe it? But if you're saying this statement up here is the truth, well, the first half of the statement says there are no the truths. Do you see that this is a the truth statement saying there are no the truths? Now, I know this is unpopular in our culture today, but there's no such thing as your truth. There's no such thing as my truth. There's just truth. I mean, if you're going to say you have your own truth, you might as well say I have my own math. I mean, imagine if Glenn asked me tomorrow, he said, Frank, you're going to be around here a few hours tomorrow. I need a little help around the house. Why don't you come over to my house? I need a little work done. I'll pay you $10 an hour. Now, Glenn would never do this. He doesn't pay that much. Anyway, so I go over to his house and I work for 10 hours. And Glenn says, well, how long did you work? I worked 10 hours. So you owe me $100,000. And he goes, $100,000? I don't owe you $100,000. I owe $100. And I go, oh, no, Glenn, you don't understand. I have my own math. Now, what's he going to say? You're crazy. There's no such thing as your math or my math. And there's no such thing as your truth or my truth. There's just truth. Look, either human beings have a right to life or they don't. That's not my truth or your truth. It's either true for everybody or it's true for nobody. It's one way or the other. Now, you might get another objection, particularly if you're a Christian, and that is, you ought not judge. You've probably heard people say that, especially if you're a Christian. Jesus said don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrite? All right, let's leave Jesus aside for just a second. What's the logical problem with this claim? Yeah, if somebody says you ought not judge, you might want to say, hey, isn't that a judgment? Or you might want to say, if we're not to judge, then why are you judging me for judging? Right? You notice this is a judgment. You say, wait a minute, Frank, didn't Jesus say don't judge? Nope, never said it. Sure he did. He said it in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. It's right in the middle of his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. All right, I know this is going to sound weird, but it's true. Just stick with me. There are no verses in the Bible. There are no verses in the Bible. Do you think when Matthew was writing his biography, which we call a gospel, that when he got to that point, he said, here's chapter 7, verse 1? No. When were the chapter and verse divisions added? About 500 years ago to help us navigate the text, which is a good thing, right? It'd be really hard to find your way around this big series of documents without numbers. I mean, imagine you go to your church one Sunday morning, you don't have numbers in your Bible, the pastor doesn't have numbers in his, he opens up the Bible and he goes, let's go about 2/3 of the way in, let's see if we can find the same spot, right? No, you wouldn't be able to do that, right? You need numbers in order to find your way around. The problem is we tend to think if it's got a number in front of it, we can take it out and make it say whatever we want. We can't do that. We have to read around the passage. In fact, I know some of you are going to hate me for this, but that's okay. I leave tomorrow. This is why Jeremiah 29:11 is not a promise to you. What's Jeremiah 29:11? Well, you see it on mugs, you see it on pillows, you see it on posters, you see it on birthday cards, right? Oh, the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, plans to give you a hope 70 years from now. Who's that written to? It's not a promise to 21st century Christians. That was written to the exiles that went to Babylon in 586 BC. It's not a promise to us. I always ask people who quote that as if it's a promise for them today, why don't you quote Jeremiah 44:11? Why? What's Jeremiah 44:11? That's the promise that God made to the exiles that went to Egypt. And he told them, don't go to Egypt. You know what Jeremiah 44:11 says? I will destroy you and all Judah. You don't see that stitched into a pillow. You don't see that on a birthday card, happy birthday. I will destroy you and all Judah. Well, thank you, Grandma. That is so sweet. Why do we take stuff out of context? Well, what's the context of Matthew 7? Read around it. Jesus doesn't say judge not and stop right there. What does he say? Judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you'll be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, you hypocrite, which is a judgment, take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first so you can better help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It's actually a command on how to judge. In other words, don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, fix it, then go help your brother. But it would be completely ridiculous to say don't make judgments. Why? Number one, it's a judgment itself. And number two, you'd be dead already if you didn't make judgments. Right? Even since we're talking about politics here today, everybody on every side of the aisle makes judgments. Right? The pro-lifers judge that that baby has a right to life. The pro-abortion people say, no, the mother has the complete right to kill that baby if she wants to. Those are all moral positions. They're both judgments. The question is, which judgment is true? So don't buy into the idea you can't make judgments. Everybody makes judgments. The only question is, are your judgments true? By the way, I will say this. You ever notice that when you compliment somebody, which is a judgment, nobody gets upset? You know, if you say to your best friend, I really love you, you're such a wonderful person, I wish I could be like you. You think your friend's going to say, well, who are you to judge? See, I've noticed that people don't have a problem with judging. They just have a problem with judgments they don't like. In fact, if you tell somebody something that's true and they get mad at you, you just help convict them. As Augustine said, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. For you military, that's Augustine, not me. Okay? We love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. For you military guys in here, and by the way, I was in the Navy for 8 years, which stands for never again volunteer yourself. You always get more flack when you're over the target. If you tell somebody the truth and they're shooting back at you, you're over the target. They don't want their evil deeds exposed. Jesus said, men love darkness rather than light. We often want to suppress the truth. I think that's what Barbara Boxer was doing. She saw that picture and she just said, I can't decide. But I will decide because I'm not going to vote to protect the baby. So, there is truth out there. There is objective morality out there. But you can't legislate morality, can you? Let's go back to all these things we listed earlier. Do we legislate on these issues? We legislate on all of them. Of course we do. The truth is, all laws legislate morality. You can't think of a law that doesn't declare one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. That's what they do. The only question is, whose morality will we legislate? That's the question. In fact, sometimes you're going to get this objection. Don't impose your morality on me. Now, if you notice, if you put this in the right format, it's the same problem we had before. If somebody says, don't impose your morals on me, what question are you going to ask them? Say it. What? Someone had it over here. Thank you, Christy. That's right. Because that's what they're doing. If somebody says, don't impose your morals on me, simply ask, then why are you imposing that moral on me? Because that's what they're doing. Notice they're saying you ought not impose ought nots, but they're imposing on you their ought not standard. But why can they do that to you, but you can't do it to anyone else? Actually, the better answer is this. If somebody says, don't impose your morals on me, I think what you ought to say is this. These aren't my morals. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles who do not have the law written on their hearts in Romans chapter 2. Everybody understands this moral law, but many people don't like it. They want to suppress it. And quite often, we as Christians do the same thing, right? We suppress things that are inconvenient. That moral law is there, so I don't want to impose my moral law. I don't want to impose your moral law. I want to impose the moral law. So, everybody's going to impose morality. The only question is whose morality? Now, there's one objection you're always going to get when this comes up. What about the separation of church and state? You're a Christian. You can't impose this. This is unconstitutional. All right. We wrote a book 25 years ago. Dr. Norman Geisler and I did. It's called Legislating Morality. It has a different cover on it. A few of you have it in here right now. It's been reprinted. And we cover this and many other objections in this book. We don't have it here now. You can get it on Amazon or our website. But the bottom line is, first of all, the First Amendment does not separate church and state. I'm not going to get into why because it doesn't really matter. Let's say the First Amendment does separate church and state. It doesn't, but let's say it does. It's irrelevant because we're not trying to legislate religion. We're not trying to tell people how, when, where, if to worship. We're not trying to tell people what sort of religious rites or rituals they need to engage in. We're not telling them they have to be part of a church or any of that. But we are telling people how they ought to treat one another. And that's what all laws do. We're not legislating religion, but we are legislating morality. Now, if there's a small group of people out there that want to legislate the Old Testament, count me out. The Old Testament was just for ancient Israel. The Bible even says that. That's why Jefferson comes along and he goes, that's not how we ought to legislate. We ought not have a state church, but we have to have a state morality. And our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence in particular, is grounded in God. That's where it comes from. We're not legislating religion. We are legislating morality, and that's what everybody's trying to do. On all sides of the aisle, everybody's trying to legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality? All right. Number 3, should Christians be involved in politics? I only have 2 questions on this, and I want to ask you what your response is to each of them, because I know a lot of Christians say we ought not be involved. Okay, first question. Should Christians care how people are treated? Does anybody disagree with that? Could anybody disagree with that? We're supposed to care for our fellow man, right? Second question. Should Christians care how people are treated by their government? Duh. So yeah, you ought to be involved in politics then. Because if you care how people are treated, you ought to care how governments treat people. In fact, who has done more evil than any other group? The government. Look at the last century. How many people were killed by governments in the last century? Estimates are 100 million. From Mao to Stalin to Hitler to Pol Pot. They're killed by governments. And we're not supposed to care about those things? Really? Of course we're supposed to care. Of course we're supposed to be involved. If we're not involved, are only atheists qualified to run the country? Where do we get that from? So from a logical perspective, we have to be involved. From a very practical perspective, we have to be involved too. Does anyone know what this is? That's the Korean Peninsula, right? South Korea right here. We fought a war over this line right here, 38th parallel. Look at South Korea. And now look at North Korea. South Korea obviously has a lot of prosperity. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. There's one major reason for the difference between South and North Korea. What is it? It's not electricity. It's politics. The South has political freedom. The North does not. Here's my question. Which country would you rather live in? Oh, you'd rather live in South Korea? Then you better be involved politically. Because there are some people that want to make it like North Korea. There are some people that want to take away all sorts of freedoms and tell you what you can and can't do in areas that they should not tell you where you can and can't do. We have to tell people what they can and can't do on certain moral issues, but not on every issue. North Korea is totalitarian. And our country appears to be sliding that way. It's a long way from that, but when censorship becomes very popular, when people can't express themselves without fear of being doxxed or fired or in some way punished, we're heading toward totalitarianism. That's why you have to be involved. In fact, politics affects almost every aspect of your life, if you think about it. The rules that are made in Washington, in Richmond, in your localities, affect almost every aspect of your life. Politics affects your church, your family, your health, your money, your business, your freedom, your property, your school, your safety, the poor, the unborn, evangelism, your faith behavior, everyone and everywhere. What do you mean your faith behavior? What does that mean? Do you realize there are people that can't live out their faith in society, particularly now when it comes to issues like same-sex weddings? If you're a photographer, if you're a baker, if you're somebody that serves the wedding industry, you will be forced, at the risk of losing your job, to do certain things that your faith tells you you can't do. So much for tolerance, so much for inclusion, so much for diversity, and our ability to evangelize. I hear pastors saying, oh, I just preach the gospel. I don't get involved politically. Newsflash, if you think the gospel is important, you better think politics are important. Why? Because politics affects your ability to preach and live the gospel. If you don't think so, why don't you go to North Korea and try setting up Liberty University? Can you do it? Can you do it in Saudi Arabia? In fact, I've been to Saudi Arabia, Iran, China. You can't do what we're doing in this room legally in those places. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. And we're asleep at the switch here in America. We think, well, we've got this Constitution. Nobody can take these rights away from us. Au contraire. What did Franklin famously say to the lady after the Constitutional Convention? Franklin was asked, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government did you give us? And Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. We better be involved, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what is the purpose of government according to the Bible? And according to common sense, what's the purpose of government? Paul talks about it in Romans 13. Government is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. In other words, good governments protect their citizens from evil. That's what governments are supposed to do. And I think the pithiest thing I've ever seen about government and human nature in one sentence was said by James Madison in Federalist 51. The guy who wrote the Constitution, by the way, was James Madison, the Bill of Rights anyway. People always look to Thomas Jefferson to figure out what the First Amendment says, you know, separation of church and state. Where was Thomas Jefferson in 1791 when the First Amendment was ratified? Anyone? Any historians? He's in France. He's an ambassador. They weren't texting him, hey, Tom, what do you think about this? No. The guy that wrote the First Amendment was James Madison. And here's what Madison said about government. Here's what Madison said about human nature. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Why do we have 3 branches of government? Because men are not angels. You need to put checks on power. Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. We have to have checks. By the way, these branches are not co-equal. What's supposed to be the strongest branch? The legislature. Why? Because the legislature is closest to the people. The legislature can impeach the other 2 branches, but the other 2 branches can't impeach the legislature. So if you really want to see why our country has gone wrong, you can go to the Congress, because the Congress can correct everything, but it doesn't. And why doesn't the Congress correct everything? Because the people don't demand it. And why don't the people demand it? Because the church has been silent. We're the problem. Thanks, Mom. In fact, he's of course agreeing with Jeremiah, who said, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? In fact, the Babylon Bee just cited a study recently to show you the evil that humanity is all about. Study finds 100% of men would eat any fruit given to them by a naked woman. You think you would have done better than Adam? No, you wouldn't. You're just as evil as he was. In fact, let's take a macro view of Christians in politics for 2,000 years. Do you realize that Christians got rid of slavery, gladiatorial combat, death games, temple prostitution, kidnapped brides, wives as property, infanticide, child labor, child marriage, child sex abuse, child prostitution, and class distinctions? Christians did all this. And by the way, is there anybody in the Bible involved in politics? Yes! All of these people were involved politically to influence their governments. Joseph, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther, Nahum, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, John the Baptist, Paul, and Jesus. Jesus was involved in politics? Yes. In fact, who did Jesus go after the most? And who were the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the Pharisees were the religious and political leaders of Israel. Rome delegated much of the day-to-day legal authority to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And who was on the Sanhedrin? Some of them were Pharisees. They were the politicians. They were making laws, and Jesus went after them. In fact, in one exchange, check out what Jesus said. This is Jesus against the politicians. This is Matthew 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Sweet and gentle Jesus said this? Yes, Jesus was not Barney, okay? Jesus was tough. Notice, he's saying you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You know, in our country, we're telling people what light bulbs they can and can't use, but we won't say, don't murder your children. Are we neglecting the weightier matters of the law? Yeah, this convicts us as well. Jesus was involved in politics, yes. Well, what are the more important matters of the law then? This is point 4. Well, Jesus, actually, I can't go through all the passages here, but you'll recognize some of the phraseology. Jesus talked about the greatest commandment: greater love, greater sin, greater judgment, greater knowledge equals a greater punishment, and the more important matters of the law. We just saw that passage. What does this imply? It implies a moral hierarchy, that everything isn't equally important. Some things are more important than other things. That's why Jesus said you're neglecting the more important matters of the law. So in our country, what are the more important matters of the law? What are they? I mean, does abortion trump everything else? Are you a one-issue voter? Probably heard that, right? Or you only care about babies before they're born. You hear that too, right? What are the more important matters of the law? Let me ask you this. What do you think Jesus thinks about little Samuel in the womb? Does he think it's a woman's right to destroy that baby? How could he? Do you realize in Luke chapter 1, when Mary goes to see Elizabeth, who's Elizabeth pregnant with? John the Baptist. And Mary has Jesus at just maybe a month after fertilization. And what does this text say when Mary gets in to see Elizabeth? Elizabeth says, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. What's in a womb? A baby. And we don't even need the Bible to tell us this. We already know there's not a squirrel in there. Okay? There's not an aardvark in a woman's tummy. There's a baby in there. And if we had the laws in Palestine or in Israel 2,000 years ago, Mary could have killed Jesus. Jesus is not obviously for abortion. So, are you a one-issue voter? Let me say this. The right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. I think it is the essential, highest issue of our time. Does that make you a one-issue voter? No. I want my candidates to be good on other issues as well. But in my view, pro-life is an essential. In other words, being pro-life doesn't necessarily qualify someone as a good candidate. If the guy or gal is pro-life, but they're terrible on everything else, they're not a good candidate. However, being pro-abortion necessarily disqualifies someone as a good candidate. So, I'm not a one-issue voter, but I am a one-issue disqualifier. If you can't see that the right to life is the right to all other rights, I can't trust you on anything else. Thank you, Glenn. I'm taking you with me everywhere. Now, there are other issues. I won't have time to cover them all tonight, but I want to mention one other issue. Freedom of religion and speech are being lost in our country. In fact, I want to show you a headline. Actually, this headline goes back to 2011. Here it is. Christian consultant fired by Bank of America over gay marriage book. Just months after being fired from Cisco Systems in California over an anti-gay marriage book, Christian consultant Dr. Frank Turek, was also given the boot from Bank of America. Yeah, back in 2008, I wrote this book, Correct, Not Politically Correct, How Same-Sex Marriage Hurts Everyone. And I was doing training in these companies, leadership training, team building training, that kind of stuff. This, of course, was not the subject of any of the training. Yet, I was fired by both Cisco and Bank of America because someone discovered I had written these books. And when I asked the HR directors at these institutions, particularly the one at Cisco, I said, can you define what inclusion, tolerance, and diversity means for me? Because why am I being excluded and not tolerated for holding a diverse view? Well, she couldn't give me anything but platitudes. So we decided to go public with it. My friend Mike Adams wrote the first column on it called The Cisco Kid. And then I wrote a column called Sex at Work. Do not Google that, by the way. Go to crossexamine.org and go to the search button there and type in Sex at Work, and you'll see the article. I tell the story of how this happened. How could it be that somebody who thinks that marriage should be between a man and a woman is somehow not tolerated? In fact, I said to her, look, I work with people of all different sexual orientations, and I treat them with respect because they're made in the image of God. But don't tell me I have to agree with their sexual life. They don't have to agree with mine either. So why are we even talking about this at work? Are we supposed to have sex at work? I mean, why is corporate America obsessed with this? What's the point? To make widgets, do we all have to agree that certain sexual practices are acceptable? Why? What's the point? Because it's a political agenda. It has nothing to do with workplace productivity. You're going to tell everybody they have to have certain political and moral views to work? Really? Our freedoms are going away, ladies and gentlemen. We should treat everybody, regardless of what they think about their sex life or regardless of what they do. We got to treat them with respect because they're made in the image of God, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with them. And it doesn't mean they have to agree with us either. I thought this was a free country. Isn't it? Maybe not much anymore. And whose fault is that? By the way, it's not the LGBTQ community that gave us same-sex marriage. You know who gave us same-sex marriage? We did. Church did. Why? Because the church 50 years ago bought into the idea that marriage is just about an emotional romantic connection between two people. Well, if marriage is just an emotional romantic connection between two people, then why does it have to be a man and a woman? Why not two men or two women, or why not even more than that? In fact, if marriage has nothing to do with children, then marriage can be genderless. And that's what it is now. It's genderless. Gender doesn't matter. By the way, if marriage isn't about children, what institution is about children? There isn't one. Does anyone know who started no-fault divorce in this country? Ronald Reagan. 1969, 1970, he was governor of California, signed a bill with good intentions. Oh, there were people caught in these bad marriages, abusive marriages. We got to make it no fault. That spread all the way across the country. Reagan later regretted it. And this helped people to think that, look, if things aren't just working out, then I can just walk away. The most important agreement in society can now be broken by one side without consequence. And whose fault is that? It's our fault. We blew it. We're the problem. And in fact, C.S. Lewis, as you know, was way ahead of his time. Just read the chapter in Mere Christianity on Christian marriage. You know, we tend to think marriage is all about love and feelings and all this. And Lewis points out that when you first meet somebody and you get infatuated with him, you think that's what love is. But when you go to the marriage altar, you can't promise to feel that way for the next 50 years. You can't promise a feeling. You might as well promise I'll never get hungry or angry again. You can't promise feelings. What can you promise? Action. That's all you can promise. You can't promise feelings. That's why you take a vow, right? You don't need a vow when you're all lovey-dovey. You don't need a vow when you're in the infatuation stage. Nobody can keep you away from one another. You need a vow when you don't feel like being around the other person. That's when you need the vow. It's not just a romantic affinity you have for somebody. It's the fact that you pledged yourself till death do you part. Because it's not just a covenant with them, it's a covenant with God and your own children. We're the problem, ladies and gentlemen. Finally, what are the top 10 questions you should ask on these issues? The first question I think you want to ask when somebody says something is, what do you mean by that? And this comes from Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. If you haven't read Tactics yet, you ought to get the book. It's a great book on how to converse with people. When somebody says something, you shouldn't try and refute what they say. It's their job to support what they say. So if someone calls you a bigot, for example, don't try and say, well, I'm not a bigot. You know what you ought to ask them? What do you mean by bigotry? What do you mean by being a bigot? In fact, I had that same-sex marriage advocate called me a bigot once. And I said, well, what do you mean by bigotry? He said, fear and intolerance. I said, that's not bigotry. Those are just two more words that need to be defined. Bigotry is having a position on an issue that you haven't looked into yourself, and you're closed to any education on this issue or any change. And I said to him, sir, with all due respect, if anyone's a bigot, it's you, because I've written an entire book on this topic, and you don't even know why I hold my position, and yet you're calling me a bigot. By the way, as soon as you ask somebody to define their terms, they're in trouble. Right? Because if bigotry means, well, you don't agree with me, well, does that mean you're a bigot because you don't agree with me? See, people use words to shut you up. Don't allow them to do that. Ask them to define their terms. What do you mean by bigotry? And then how did you come to that conclusion? This is especially effective when you're talking about issues related to Christian apologetics. You know, somebody says, well, I can't believe in the Bible because it's been changed throughout the centuries. First of all, what do you mean by that? What do you mean it's been changed throughout the centuries? Can you explain how you think we got the Bible? And then how'd you come to that conclusion? Have you investigated the manuscript evidence for yourself? I guarantee you the person isn't going to say, yeah, just last night I was up reading a book about the Byzantine line of manuscripts. Right? They're not going to say that. You know what most people build their worldview around? Slogans. They hear a slogan they like, and they put it together with other slogans, not recognizing the slogans aren't even true, and if they were true, they'd be mutually contradictory. And as soon as you question them on the evidence for the slogan, they're out of intellectual justification. So ask them, how'd you come to that conclusion? Have you investigated the manuscript evidence for yourself? And then you can add a third question. It goes like this. Have you ever considered that we didn't get the Bible through the telephone game like you may think? We got the Bible when eyewitnesses wrote it down, and we can compare all the manuscripts we have over the centuries and reconstruct the original with more than 99% accuracy. Right? It's a way of you providing evidence back to the person. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? Okay. Now, I got a warning here. Well, you can use these questions for anything. Parents, you can use these questions with your kids, right? Like suppose your son calls you one night and says, Dad, I'm not going to be home by 11 like you wanted me to. Don't panic. Just say, first question, what do you mean by that? Second question, how'd you come to that conclusion? Third question, have you ever considered if you're not home by 11, you're grounded for 2 weeks? Be right home, Dad! Right. But husbands, never use these questions on your wives, right? Because if she calls you an idiot, don't say, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? You know, in my case, my wife has a list 37 years long. I mean, I'm toast. Spencer knows, I'm toast. So ask those questions. Third question, do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Why is that a good question? Because if somebody says, oh, what do you think about same-sex marriage? Or what do you think about abortion? Or what do you think about transgender issues? What do you think of? Stop and say, hey, before I answer that, that's a great question. You mind if I ask you a question? Do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Well, of course I am. What are you going to say then? Great, because if I offer an opinion different from yours, you'll tolerate it then, right? In other words, you are setting a trap that they may step into right away. Then you can ask questions like this. Where do rights come from? They don't come from governments. They come from God. If they came from governments, that would mean that when a new government takes over and decided you didn't have that right anymore, you didn't have a right. That wouldn't be a right, that'd be a preference. And where does your moral standard come from? How do you make decisions on right and wrong? Do you determine right or wrong, or you discover right and wrong? If you determine it, it's just your opinion. If you discover it, it's God's nature that you're discovering. Oh, here's a loaded one today. Are men and women different? Just ask the question. If they say yes, okay, good. If they say no, then transgenderism is impossible. Why? Why is it impossible? Do you realize that transgenderism presupposes fixed genders? Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is in order to know I have this mismatch between my psychology and my biology. If there were no fixed genders, there couldn't be this mismatch. I also have to have some idea of what a man is and some idea of what a woman is in order to try and make the so-called transition. So transgenderism on one hand presupposes fixed genders. On the other hand, it tries to say there are no fixed genders. Look, a human being can only do one of two things, produce a sperm or an egg. There's no third category. Those are the two categories. Did you ever think we would be talking about this in a political context? Did you ever think we would? And this is not to say, there are people out there that genuinely struggle with gender dysphoria. But until 10 years ago, it was only one of every 10,000 young men who thought they were women. Now you have so many more girls thinking they're guys. And you know where this is coming from? Social media. It's a social media contagion. In fact, I've just updated the Correct, Not Politically Correct book. It'll be out in April. There's a whole new section on transgenderism. But you know who's making the most sense on this issue right now? I know you're not going to believe this. Well, maybe you will. You guys know who Bill Maher is? Okay. 20 years ago, I was on his program, Correct, Not Politically Correct, a few times. And he's a classical liberal, right? He's an atheist, classical liberal, thinks people ought to have free speech and all this. The left has left him behind. In fact, he had a show on last May called Along for the Pride, where he said, look, back in 1940, look how many people claim to be LGBTQ. He said, at this pace, if we continue, we'll all be gay by 2060. Right? He says, this is a social contagion here. Why are people in Ohio not doing this? It's happening in California, New York. In fact, with regard to the transgender issue, he said, are you telling me all babies are born in the wrong bodies? He said, if the world knew what it wanted to be when it was 8, the world would be filled with cowboys and princesses. He said, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pirate. Thank God nobody took me seriously and took me for peg leg and eye removal surgery. It's madness what we're doing to children right now. And tragically, look, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what has happened. The Biden administration, at the end of March last year, put out a memo that said, parents, if you don't engage with your child with gender-affirming care, if your 3-year-old, as young as 3, thinks he's a girl, and you don't affirm him in that, the government may come and take your child away from you. I'm not making this up. I can send you all the documentation. That's where we are. And whose fault is it? It's not Joe Biden's fault. It's our fault. Because we haven't been engaged. We're allowing this to happen because we can't get involved. We're just going to preach the gospel. One day you're not going to be able to preach the gospel. This continues. This university one day will be shut down. Church will be shut down. Because people are evil. And we're supposed to be what? Salt and light. Here's what Thomas Sowell said all about this. Ours may become the first civilization destroyed not by the power of our enemies, but by the ignorance of our teachers and the dangerous nonsense they are teaching our children. In an age of artificial intelligence, they are creating artificial stupidity. He's right. I don't even know if Thomas Sowell's a Christian, but he's smart, and he's 92 years old. He's seen everything. How about number 6? For what purpose is the government involved in marriage? Is the government supposed to affirm romantic affinity? Is that why the government's involved in marriage? No, the reason the government's involved in marriage is to perpetuate and stabilize society. And only a man and a woman can procreate and then best bring up a child so that child turns out to be a good citizen. That's the reason the government's involved in marriage. It's not to recognize that Bill loves Julie or Steve loves John. The purpose of marriage is to perpetuate and stabilize society from a government's perspective. That's why we should always favor the man-woman relationship over every other relationship, because it's the ground of civilization. I mean, think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. What would happen if everyone lived faithfully in natural marriage, marriage between a man and a woman? It's not traditional marriage. It's not just someone's fashion. It's natural marriage based on the biological realities of a man and a woman. What would happen if we all lived faithfully in that kind of relationship? What would happen to our crime rate? What would happen to our tax policy? What would happen to child abuse? What would happen to abortion? What would happen to children being left out in the cold? What would happen? All of those things would go down. Next question. What would happen if everyone lived faithfully in same-sex marriage? It would be the end of civilization. Now, I'm not saying a law that allows same-sex marriage would do this. I'm simply saying this to give you an idea of the reason that a government should favor the man-woman relationship over every other relationship. It's the ground of civilization. It's not bigotry, it's biology. That's just the way things are. Should we create new racism to fix old racism? That's basically what CRT is. That's a big issue. We don't have time to cover it here. Maybe we can do it during the Q&A, which is coming up here in a minute. We have on our YouTube channel a little over an hour talk on it. We have an entire DVD set or MP4 set called Jesus versus the Culture. But why are we creating new racism to fix old racism? How does that solve the problem? It just adds to the problem. Should children have their bodies mutilated and made infertile to address a feeling that's likely to go away by age 18? Do you realize that 80% of young people who experience gender dysphoria as a teenager, by the time they hit 18, they're through with it? If no intervention is made. And yet we have people wanting to cut them up and make them sterile for a political agenda? Does love require approval? Do you disagree with those you love? See, in our culture, we think love requires approval. Love does not require approval. In fact, how many people in here are parents? Right? How many people in here are former children? Okay, good. That's all of us. If your parent approved of everything you wanted to do, would that parent have been loving? No. You have to stand in the way of evil if you're a parent. That's how you love people. You don't approve of everything they want to do. And yet in our culture, we think, well, if you love me, you'll approve what I want to do. That's not love. The passage that everybody reads at their wedding, but nobody obeys. 1 Corinthians 13. First of all, there's no feelings in there. It's all action. And look what Paul says about love. He says, love always protects. Love rejoices in the truth. Love always perseveres. You want to love somebody? You tell them the truth. You don't do what Thomas Sowell had said here. We said it earlier. When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. You know, Jesus gave us one new command. Here's the one new command. Love one another as I have loved you. How did he love us? He sacrificed himself for us. You know what we do when we tell people what they want to hear? We sacrifice them for our benefit. When we tell people what they need to hear, we're sacrificing ourselves for their benefit. Why? Why do we tell people what they want to hear? So they don't get mad at us. So we don't get any blowback. But when we tell people what they need to hear, we'll take the blowback out of love for them. My first pastor said this, and I think it's good advice. What you should tell people in your life whom you love is that there's nothing you can do that will make me stop loving you. There's nothing you can do that will make me stop loving you. And because I love you, I'm not going to agree with you all the time. I'm not the standard of right and wrong. I'm not the standard of morality. There's someone beyond me. Final question. If they're talking about an issue where Jesus or the apostles have spoken, so you disagree with Jesus on this issue. On marriage, what did he say marriage was in Matthew 19 between a man and a woman? On sexual immorality, oh, Jesus never spoke about homosexuality. No, he did. Because in Mark chapter 7, he says, it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, but what makes him come out of a man. What comes out of a man that makes him unclean. And he talks about theft and sexual immorality and a number of other things. What was sexual immorality in his day? Any sexual behavior outside of the marriage of a man and a woman. It included adultery. It included fornication. It included homosexuality. It included bestiality. It included any of these things. He spoke about the category. He may not have uttered the term homosexuality or bestiality or any of these other things. But he talked about the category. Just like he didn't say felony home invasion is wrong. But he talked about theft being wrong. The category. So just ask people, so you disagree with Jesus on this? Oh, okay. Notice how everybody wants to have Jesus on their side? Everybody wants to have Jesus on their side. Well, I'm reminded of what somebody said to Lincoln when, during the Civil War, they said to him, hey, do you think God is on our side? And President Lincoln said, let's pray that we're on his side. That's the real issue. Unfortunately, even in the church, the new religion in America is more meology than theology. It's all about me, whatever I want. So, summary. Does objective morality exist? Of course it does. You know torturing babies for fun is wrong. You know slavery is wrong. You know racism is wrong. You know all these things are wrong. So there must be a standard of right. You can't legislate morality, can you? That's the only thing you can do. Should Christians be involved in politics? Of course. Everyone ought to be involved. Particularly Christians, because we're supposed to be salt and light. And we have to protect not only our ability to live the gospel, but our ability to preach the gospel. What are the most important issues? The most important issue in our country is life. The right to life is the right to all other rights. Religious freedom is going away too, ladies and gentlemen.